Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to be invited. This is my very first time visiting Duke University. It's just as pretty as I've been told, almost as pretty as Princeton, where I did my undergraduate degree. And I'm going to be talking about Hayek and the history of liberalism. And because Bruce told me that some people might be undergraduates who have no particular familiarity with the work of Friedrich Hayek, I thought I'd just begin by saying who this person was besides the guy with the mustache you see on the posters all the time here. So he lived a very long time, as you can see. He was born in Vienna, which, as we'll get to, is in fact quite an important fact about him. He won a Nobel Prize in economics. And of course, like most Nobel Prizes in economics, that wouldn't be enough to preserve him from complete and total oblivion after 10 or 20 years outside of very small professional circles. But he was far more than a mere Nobel Prize-winning economist. He was one of the major political theorists of the 20th century, the founder of the famous or infamous, depending on which circle you run in, Montpellier Society. And someone who remains today, in many respects, an extremely influential thinker in a surprisingly wide network of political circles, as well as, of course, an important figure in the history of economics. And I'm going to be trying to talk about three things today, which is probably one thing too many. I generally urge people to never try to do more than two things in a lecture, but I'm only going to be here once, so you're going to get three. One is to explain how Hayek saw the history of liberalism. The second is to tell you at least a little bit about the real history of liberalism, as I see it in a mere 500 pages or so. You can get the details outside if you like later. And then why, despite his errors about the history of liberalism, Hayek's liberalism is still not just important today, but I think probably more important today than it would have been, let us say, 20 years ago. So we'll get to all that, but we'll start first with Hayek's understanding of liberalism, which was, I would suggest, greatly oversimplified, and which I'm going to oversimplify even more in order to present it to you in a relatively concise way. And so the very basic outline of his history, according to Hayek, is there are good liberals and there are bad liberals. And the good liberals were dominant from roughly 1776, a date that may be familiar to you, until around 1870 or so, and that bad liberals, notice that they're red, of course, bad liberals have been dominant ever since. Hayek, in fact, actually had some issues with what he should call himself. And he wrote a famous essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, in which he also expressed some reluctance to call himself a liberal because of just how confusing that word was, particularly on the American scene, where it often meant people who were far to the left of where Hayek would position himself. In fact, he said, I would like to call myself an old Whig, that's W-H-I-G, but of course then nobody would have the faintest idea what I meant, so that isn't very useful either. So he reluctantly described himself as a liberal or a classical liberal. I'll get to that in a minute. But the history of liberalism, as for Hayek's point of view, is basically two parts, good, bad, in that order and in that time frame. So you want to know, of course, well, what makes someone a good liberal as opposed to a bad liberal? And the answer is good liberals are individualists. They're the people who call themselves classical liberals. Now, classical liberal is actually an historical term. That is to say, people around the 1870s in Britain start referring to themselves as classical liberals. And this is in distinction to the people who in Britain are called new liberals. The classical liberals have a strong commitment to laissez-faire economics, a very strong distrust of state intervention in anything. The new liberals in Britain, and they have parallels in other places, progressives in America, Solidarists in France, social liberals in Germany. These are people who want to use the state for various purposes, chiefly to fight the problem of poverty. The welfare state is actually, in most of the West, Germany being an exception, but in most of the West it's a liberal creation, but not with the consent of all liberals. The classical liberals think that this buildup of the authority and reach of the state is in fact going to be a disastrous result, that it's going to be useless in the long run for the poor and catastrophic for human freedom. And they believe that liberalism is about not just laissez-faire economics, but is all about individuals and individual freedom. The bad liberals, the word that Hayek uses for them is collectivists, because they want collective control over various things. And the example is the modern, well, I call modern liberals. New liberalism is the British example of that. And one final distinction that's very important to Hayek between the good liberals and the bad liberals, and this one transcends the chronology, the distinction between good liberals dominant before 1870, bad liberals dominant thereafter. For Hayek, good liberals speak English and bad liberals speak French or German, and other languages too, you know, Italian and so on. And Hayek has a very strong notion that there is what he calls an Anglo-American or sometimes Anglo-Saxon liberal tradition. This is where all the good liberals live. And there's this bad, what he calls continental with a capital C liberal tradition. For him, Britain is very definitely not part of Europe. And those liberals, the French and German-speaking liberals, they're doing something else. They are certainly not classical liberals. They are interventionists. They don't really understand individualism, and so on and so forth. So that, in a nutshell, is the basic outline of Hayek's understanding of the history of liberalism. Alas, Hayek was wrong. Historically, in the first place, the vast majority of 19th century liberals, including in Britain, are nothing like laissez-faire purists. They are consistently appealing to say, or rather, consistently approving of state intervention in all kinds of ways that a laissez-faire liberal would not approve. Laissez-faire is very much a minority position, even where it's strongest, that is to say, in British liberalism, even or especially in the period of 1870. Furthermore, this notion that liberalism is somehow tied particularly to some notion of individualism is very much a 20th century invention. That is to say, liberals in the 19th century, of course they thought about individuals and individual freedom, but they were just as likely to think in terms of groups, of classes, of communities. If you think about the very earliest people who we talk about in liberal terms, I would call them proto-liberals for a reason I can get into. Somebody like Locke, he's talking about freedom of religion. That means freedom of the individual conscience, but it also absolutely means the freedom of different churches, groups, classes of people to exercise as a community freedoms that are being denied to them. And 19th century social and political thought in general is saturated with the notion of class, liberalism included. When liberals think about freedom, they think in class terms just as much or more than they think in individual terms. And again, you can find this throughout the spectrum of liberal thought. Even in, let us say, the founding fathers of the United States, think about Federalist number 10. What is Madison talking about? Factions. Factions are groups. They are not individuals. And that's what we have to concern ourselves with. And of course, what goes with this is that 19th century liberals do not speak more English than French or even German. Even Hayek's favorite liberals are, in fact, not really very Anglo-Saxon at all. So, if Hayek is wrong, where does all this come from? It comes from a very specific place. It comes from England around 1900, when liberalism is having a big set of internal conflicts, and when we have the great split between the classical liberals and the new liberals, and our two liberal factions set about writing their own histories of liberalism. This is often why people write histories, in order to show that my side is not only right now, but it's been right forever, and all our great heroes were members of my faction. And we have two such histories of liberalism that appear between about 1890 and 1905 in England. One by A.V. Dicey, who is a classical liberal, and one by L.T. Hobhouse, who is a new liberal. Hobhouse tells you that no, liberals never had the slightest trace of laissez-faire economics. From the very beginning, Adam Smith on, Locke on, laissez-faire, nothing to do with liberalism. Mr. Dicey, liberalism is all about laissez-faire from the very beginning. Smith, Bentham, all the way down to the present. There was this bad thing that happened around 1865 when the collectivists took over and us classical liberals started losing, but this is the way the history of liberalism works, and it's the classical liberal variety that is the only true faith. You'll note some of the vocabulary I just used, as well as some of the dates that Dicey uses, sound just like what I just attributed to Hayek. Not an accident. This is where it comes from. And it gets to Hayek in two different ways. One, you can find this history and this vocabulary repeated with copious citations of Dicey in Walter Lippmann's work, The Good Society, which Hayek read very carefully. And we know that Hayek read Dicey. There are a couple of footnotes to Dicey and to the work where this appears, even though he does not cite this particular argument of Dicey's on his own. I think because he couldn't, he didn't want to offend Lippmann by saying, well, Lippmann's actually Dicey. But for whatever reason, it's clear Hayek has adopted Dicey's history, his vocabulary, his chronology, his argument about Anglo-Saxon versus continental liberalism. It's all in the Dicey. And the really interesting thing here, the really surprising thing here, is both Hayek and Dicey knew better. They knew that what they were saying was actually not true. So Hayek's Anglo-Saxon tradition includes a lot of people who are pretty French. Here you see quotations from Hayek, Frenchmen like Montesquieu and later Benjamin Constant, and above all Alexis de Tocqueville, are probably nearer to what we have called the British than to the French tradition. And later he adds also the young Turgot, Condillac, another 18th century French philosopher, Renan, a 19th century French philosopher, and in Germany, even Kant. So our Anglo-Saxon tradition here, not very Anglo-Saxon unless you want to count the Norman invasion as bonus French points. It's full, in fact, of French people. Hayek knows this. He says so. And yet he persists in calling it the Anglo-Saxon tradition. And it's also curious, Dicey did something quite similar. That is to say, make a number of statements that he actually knew were false and went ahead and says them anyway. So, for example, it's ridiculous to consider Bentham a laissez-faire economist. Bentham is full of state intervention. Yet Dicey calls him a laissez-faire economist and puts in a footnote that, well, actually, he wasn't. But I'm going to go on calling these people the Benthamites. Why? Because he saw Bentham's individualism, and that part was true. Bentham is one of the few thinkers who never thinks in terms of groups in the 19th century. That Bentham's individualism sets the pattern for 19th century liberalism till around 1870, according to Dicey. And for Dicey, individualism is naturally and inextricably linked with laissez-faire economics. So therefore, Bentham is spiritually a laissez-faire economist, even though he isn't actually a laissez-faire economist at all. This doesn't bother Dicey at all, because as far as Dicey is concerned, he's not actually writing history. Dicey is not a historian. Dicey is a lawyer. He's a common lawyer. He is looking for the common law underlying principle of classical liberalism. He finds it in individualism, and he gives the name of that to Bentham. It's Benthamite individualism. And the historical bits, well, it's just history, who cares? Hayek, too, knows better than to say that liberalism is Anglo-Saxon, at least the good part, or that the kind of liberals he likes are essentially Anglo-Saxon. You know, he loves Tocqueville. He's very fond of Constant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yet he still insists on saying this is Anglo-Saxon liberalism. Unlike Dicey, he's not a lawyer. He's also not a historian. But there's a reason why he does this. So what is Hayek's motivation for making these rather strange choices in vocabulary? Well, first of all, again, consider the historical context. So you're going to first find this distinction made in at least an elaborate form in The Road to Serfdom, published in 1945. Hayek is formulating this from the late 30s on. Where is he doing this? In London. Why is he in London? Because he's fleeing the Nazis. He desperately wants to naturalize liberalism in Britain and in America, his new home. Places that are quite suspicious of the French and the Germans. And this is in part simply a wartime political gesture. I don't want to go around saying those, the French, and they're now run by Vichy, right? They're all fascists. And the Germans are really important contributors to the liberal tradition, because that kind of discredits liberalism here. I want to say, no, they're Native American. They're Native British. So liberalism will be Anglo-American. Otherwise, it may not be. Stage one. Stage two, after World War II, when the dominant current in liberal thought is what I call the end of ideology movement. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. There, once again, Hayek sees his brand of liberalism being excluded, and his voice very much a minority voice in this period. And therefore, since Britain, but above all America, is now the dominant intellectual, economic, military, political, whatever power of this world, it's important for him to anchor liberalism in an Anglo-Saxon culture. And to say, look, I'm on your side, you ought to be on my side in the current struggle for the soul of liberalism. So this is one of my three things, right? This is Hayek's history of liberalism. And I've explained to you that it's wrong and shown you a couple of bits of evidence as to why it's, if not wrong, at least it's obviously kind of odd and contradictory. But the second thing I want to do is give you a little bit of what I think is a better way of looking at liberalism, naturally, of course, my way of looking at liberalism, and also show you a little bit how Hayek fits into this, the historical role of Hayek within the history of liberalism. So my title goes two ways, and I talk about Hayek in the history of liberalism. So one of the reasons Hayek got himself tied into all kinds of knots here was because liberalism is a difficult word, right? I would be reasonably confident in saying that by some definition once widely used of the word liberal, everyone in this room is a word liberal. And if there's one exception, that's probably the maximum. The word liberal today, if you say I'm a liberal in the United States, you're on the left. If I say je suis un libéral in France, I'm most definitely on the right. They mean all kinds of different things. I can talk in some detail about that later if people would like me to. So it's a word that needs definition. And I spent a lot of time, like a decade, maybe more, trying to come up with a definition of liberalism that would both mean something to an ordinary person and not be completely empty for an academic audience. And what I eventually came up with is this. Liberalism is the search for a society in which no one need be afraid. No one means no one. Not rich people, and not poor people, not black people, not white people, and not religious people, not atheists, not men, not women. No one. That's the goal. It is, of course, a utopian goal in the literal sense of it is a goal that has never been realized in any actually existing human society. As I'll say in a moment, it's a goal that has developed in lots of ways over time. Rather to my surprise, after I wrote the book, I occasionally got pushback in a particular way. Some people would say to me, but every political movement wants that. That doesn't separate liberals from everybody else. Nobody wants anybody to be afraid. Well, of course, that's nonsense. A whole lot of political ideologies think that some people ought to be afraid. If you're a communist, you think the bourgeoisie ought to be afraid. If you're a racist, you think that people of the wrong race ought to be afraid. Lots and lots of people historically have thought that people of the wrong religion ought to be afraid. And most of the time, men have thought that women ought to be afraid. So in all kinds of ways, fear, the fear of certain people at least, has been considered entirely right and proper. That is not the liberal view. The liberal view is that no one ought to be afraid. Now, of course, this doesn't cover all fears. If you are afraid of spiders, there's nothing liberalism can do for you. If you are afraid of the dark, liberals can't help you either. If you're afraid of death, probably not. So what I'm talking about when we talk about a society in which no one need be afraid, we mean essentially afraid of other people, and in particular, people in uniforms. The soldier, the policeman, the clergyman. Those are the people that have historically frightened people. We can throw in the taxman. Lots of countries, tax people wear uniforms too, and so on. Liberals want you to be afraid, to need to be afraid of no one. It's okay if you're afraid of the policeman, if you're a murderer. We'd rather like that. But it's a distinction that I think is not really too hard to figure out. Now, some of you will have said, this is just Judith Shklar, liberalism of fear. We've heard all this before. Mostly what I have in common with Judith Shklar is the title. Because for her, and by the way, I had the honor of meeting her once. She was a wonderful woman, and besides being brilliant, she was a force of nature. But she shared one thing in common with both Dicey and Hayek. She was not a historian. She was a political theorist, and she neither knew much history nor was she really terribly interested in history. And so for her, a historically undifferentiated fear was fine. But as a historian of political thought, it's not fine if you want to understand how liberalism has actually developed. And there have been, in my view, 4 historical fears, 4 problems that have concentrated liberal minds at different periods. And I'm very proud of that PowerPoint effect, by the way. They were and are originally the fear of religious persecution linked to royal despotism, then the fear of either revolution or reaction in response to revolution, then the fear of poverty, and finally the fear of totalitarianism. So the fear of religious persecution and despotism dominated liberal thought in the 17th and 18th century until the American and French revolutions. And I will insist on the role of the American as well as the French Revolution here. Touch of Anglo-Saxonism, perhaps. The fear of revolution or reaction from those revolutions until roughly 1870, or more precisely, the 8th of May, 1873, which is when John Stuart Mill died in Avignon. Then the fear of poverty during the fin de siècle. Poverty is not new. The poor have been with us always. But until the very end of the 19th century, people were mostly afraid of the poor. Who was most likely to be illiberal? Who was going to be the religious fanatic? Who was going to be the revolutionary or counter-revolutionary fanatic? It was the poor person. You were going to be afraid of them. After 1870s, 1880s, instead of being afraid of the poor, people began to consider that the poor had a lot to be afraid of, and that you could actually do something about it. This required a certain level of wealth. If you had England is the wealthiest country of the world in 1820. If you had divided all the wealth of England equally, the result would have been everybody was in extreme poverty. There was nothing you could do to eliminate poverty in 1820, no matter what policy you adopted. 1890, England is a lot richer. It begins to become conceivable that if you could maybe not eliminate poverty, but actually do something about it. And so liberals begin to think that something can be done about the fears of the poor. And then after World War I and the Great Depression, we have Hitler, we have Stalin. Totalitarianism becomes the fear that concentrates liberal minds. And this continues after World War II. We still have the Soviet Union. And even post-Soviet Union, we start imagining totalitarianism in all kinds of new ways. Think patriarchy, if you like. And this is what concentrates liberal minds. And so we have, as a result, 4 historical liberalisms. The proto-liberalism of the period before the American French revolutions. Why do I call it proto? Because the word liberal had no political meaning at the time. If you said in 1750, I'm a liberal person, nobody would take that as having any political meaning. They would think you were saying that you were generous, perhaps that you were broad-minded in terms of religion, but views about politics or even economics, no. Economics by the 1770s, a little. Politics, not then. If you look in the textbooks, you'll still find some textbooks that say the first political usage of liberal is in 1810 in Spain, where you get the first political party. By 1797, Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant are using the word liberal to represent a political position which is both anti-Jacobin terror and anti the return of the monarchy. Somebody, I just read an article, suggested this actually was used like this as early as 1794. In any case, around this time, people start using the word liberal to mean something politically. This is the first usage. This is what I call liberalism 1.0, with due apologies to Microsoft. The second fear, right, or the third fear, the fear of poverty, gives birth after the 1870s and 1880s to Liberalism 2.0 and the great liberal split between the classical liberals, saw this in Hayek, right, the classical liberals who are laissez-faire types, and the modern liberals who want to use the state to fight poverty, the fear of the moment. And then after World War II, we have the end of ideology movement. There are a whole lot of people who think, what got us totalitarianism? People with deep value commitments in politics. Communists, fascists, Nazis. We want to avoid fear, avoid totalitarianism, avoid despotism. What do we need to do? Let's get rid of ideology. Let's avoid all these great big ideological commitments. Let's stop talking even in terms of freedom if we don't have to. Let's do a little technical tinkering here and there, a little Keynesian adjustment, a little bit more welfare state here or there, but always in non-ideological terms, because ideology brings totalitarianism. Well, by the time we get to the late 1960s, it becomes clear that this might be a nice idea, but it's not true. In the 50s, it seems like it might actually be true. A lot of the massive, deep ideological polarization that had characterized Western societies before World War II in the 1950s seems to have gone away. Except for a handful of communists, we're all against the communists, and the rest of us, we're all sort of happy here in the middle. So isn't that great? Well, 1968, Vietnam War, counterculture, ideology comes roaring back in. And so now a lot of it is, well, we kind of wish there was no more ideology. But there is, so we got to deal with it. And we move on to a new phase of liberalism beginning in the 1970s, a new variation on anti-totalitarian liberalism, basically splitting into the egalitarians and the libertarians. This is the classical modern liberal distinction on steroids, right? So John Rawls wants to go way beyond fighting poverty. He wants to bring about, in fact, a radical version of equality. Yeah, I know about the difference principle, but it's still a radical version of equality. And libertarians become even more purist than the classical liberals were in their laissez-faire rejection and limitation of the state. And that takes us more or less down to roughly 2000. But there's one point I want to stress here, and it's a methodological point. And there's the one picture of my slideshow. So be grateful. Liberalism is an oyster. What it is not, what no serious tradition of intellectual thought is, what it is not is a tree. We've been talking about trees and genealogies for far too long. It's a horrible image. When you think about a tree, what do you think about? A main trunk and little branches. When you think about a genealogy, what do you think about? Founding father, if you like founding mother, and a line of direct descent. There's no founding fathers or mothers of liberalism. No one's ever claimed to be, hey, I'm the first liberal. No historian with any sense has ever said, oh, liberalism begins with this person. And there's no single line of liberalism. All these fears I've been talking about, they don't magically disappear. They remain, just like an oyster shell, right? Every layer of that oyster's growth is still visible. None of them have disappeared. They're all there at the same time. Today, there are still people who are fundamentally liberal 1.0 kind of people, and others who are liberal 2.0, and others who mix and match. So the fears don't simply replace one another. They get overlaid, right? And so, for example, some of the people who were worried about the growth of the welfare state thought, you know, what's going to happen is the welfare state is going to go on expanding, taxes are going to go on rising, and what are we going to have as a result? Revolution or reaction. Coming back to the original fears of Liberalism 1.0. So this kind of argument is commonplace, and this kind of multiple layering is commonplace both for liberals and I think for all kinds of political thought. Now you may ask, well, you know, we're not really worried too much about totalitarianism as such today. So what is it that is concentrating liberal minds now? And the answer to that you can probably come up with by yourself: populism. The fifth great fear that liberalism confronts. And of course, there's argument about whether populism is democratic or not. It seems to me obvious that personally that populism is, but other people are quite sure that it's not. But no one has ever said populism is liberal, right? Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, says, I am an illiberal Democrat. Even outside the United States, everybody who's a populist is happy to dump on liberalism, whatever that means to them. It's bad. And how do we know that populists are in fact illiberal? Because populists always want to make someone afraid. Depending on what country you're in and whether we're talking about left populism or right populism, because both of those things exist, sometimes populists want to make black people afraid, sometimes they want to make white people afraid, just about always they want to make immigrants afraid. Populists, by the way, because of this aspect of their thought, never actually lose a free and fair election. They always win them. And the reason for this is simple. The real people, the people who really belong to their nation, always vote for them. The ones who are voting against them are people who are not really Hungarians or Poles or Americans. They are people of the wrong ethnicity, people of the wrong religion, they're immigrants, and always they're the elite, who are never really true Hungarians or Poles or Americans, etc. And populists want to make those people afraid, and they always win the elections among the people who are the real people. Okay, so that's how I see the history of liberalism. Where does Hayek fit into this history? Well, Hayek is somebody whose political atmosphere is formed in the late 1930s, even though he lives a very long time. He's an anti-totalitarian liberalism. And for me, anti-totalitarianism is, in fact, the overall motif, or underlying motif, I guess is the correct metaphor, of Hayekian thought. Okay, here's the question that we've all been asked at some point by a professor, a book reviewer, what have you. So what? So Hayek got the history of liberalism wrong, and there's this other history of liberalism. What does it matter from our basic perspective today? And I would like to suggest that it actually matters a great deal, and that Hayek also matters a great deal. One of the advantages of seeing liberalism as an oyster is it makes it much easier to justify retrieving various bits of past liberals, because all the parts of the oyster are relevant, right? They're all necessary to keep the animal in good shape. He needs the whole shell. If there are holes in it, got problems. So for me, what matters is that rescuing Hayek from his history, rescuing Hayek from his history can help rescue both Hayek and liberalism today. And in part, it's simply the recollection of some of the things that he did. And now, since I'm back lecturing in the United States for the first time in a while, I shall give you all a trigger warning that on the next screen, a word that fills some people with rage and makes others foam at the mouth with fear is going to appear on the screen, and that you all should be duly prepared for this word. And the word I'm talking about, which you will see in duly red-painted fright letters, is, of course, the dreaded word neoliberalism.
I call that the N-word.
Yeah, indeed. And interestingly enough, Hayek is one of the handful of first people to use this word, but not at all in the context that we normally imagine it. So Hayek was part of one of the most remarkable endeavors in the history of political thinking, as far as I'm concerned. It took place in Paris, where all remarkable endeavors take place. In 1938, it was called the Colloque Lippmann. Lippmann was Walter Lippmann, an American political theorist and later a very prominent American journalist who'd written a book called The Good Society, which impressed a whole lot of people, including Hayek, as providing a way forward for liberalism. And I invite you to think about the circumstances of 1938. Right? After World War I, with the exception of Russia, all of Eastern and Central Europe has revolutions, becomes liberal democratic states, and everything seems just about as wonderful as it did when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, or when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. And then everything went to hell, right? By 1938, we have the fascists in Italy. We have the Nazis in Germany. Every country in Eastern Europe, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, is a dictatorship. And of course, in Russia, we have Stalin. And by the way, everybody blames World War I on the liberals, including the liberals. World War I was definitely not the fault of liberals or liberalism, but that doesn't matter. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the notion is, look, the liberals were the dominant thing of the 19th century right up to World War I. What happened then? World War I, it must be the fault of the liberals. And as I said, a whole lot of liberals shared this false sense of self-responsibility of, we really screwed up. And even if you didn't think that liberalism screwed up with World War I, you had to be aware that a whole lot of the world had just tried liberalism and abandoned it for some kind of totalitarian or more standard issue authoritarian dictatorship. And liberals are thinking, we've got to do something different. And so Hayek organizes this conference in Paris, to which he invites just about every liberal luminary around in the Western world. They don't all come. A whole lot of them do come. But he invites just about anybody he can think of. And what these people do is they, with certain exceptions like Ludwig von Mises, they all admit we cannot keep on doing what we were doing. And one of the first things they say is this split between classical liberals and some form of modern liberalism about the role of the state and how to fight poverty and so on, we have to overcome that. We can't keep on fighting that battle. It's catastrophic. And this is where you get, for the first time, some kind of consensus. Okay, liberalism going forward has to embrace some kind of social safety net. Something you'll find that Hayek consistently maintains throughout his very long life, even though the content changes some towards the end. And this becomes, with some rare exceptions, accepted. And this is the first meaning of neoliberalism. What does neoliberalism mean? It means we're overcoming the classical modern liberal split. And we're finding new ways forward in order to fight totalitarianism more successfully than we've been doing up to now, because up to now is not working in 1938. So they make a rather remarkable amount of progress, but they don't work out a whole lot of the details. They're going to meet again in 1939, but we all know what happens in 1939, and so they never do meet again. the Montpellier society that Hayek founds after the war is in some sense the continuation of the project of the Colloquialism, but never reaches quite the sort of broad and completely open-ended scope of the original colloquialism. So in one sense, that's a very contemporary situation of today. Liberalism faced with populism. There are some people who say, well, if you just keep on shouting a little bit louder and a little bit longer, eventually those idiots out there will give up populism and come over to our side. But more thoughtful people say, no, obviously what you did before didn't work then, so why do you expect it to work now? The last chapter of my book here is called Liberalism and Populism and discusses some of the reasons for that, and I'll discuss some more of them in a moment. But in fact, in today's situation, it's not just Hayek's ability to rethink that's important. It's certain particular aspects of Hayek's political thought. Hayek is, in fact, the great answer to both the populists and the tech bros. Populists of both the left and the right, and the tech bros of both the left and the right. Right now we're concentrating on the ones on the right, but there are ones on the left too who are just as dangerous. And what's crucial here is Hayek's epistemological modesty, which is a complicated way of saying the fact that he recognizes what we don't know, what we can't know, what is often referred to as the knowledge problem. Originally, this was an economic question. Is it possible for a socialist economy to know enough to actually set and fix prices? And the answer was, for Hayek, no. No individual ever has all that kind of knowledge, nor yet a committee. That there's lots of little bits of scattered knowledge out there, and the market, through a sort of invisible hand, pulls it together and produces a correct price for a given item at a given time. But Hayek's notion of the importance of recognizing our ignorance, our invincible ignorance, no matter how good a computer you might happen to own, is broadly speaking applicable to freedom all over the place. Freedom is ignorance properly understood, knowing what we don't know and what we can't know. And this is what Donald Rumsfeld knew and Elon Musk will never understand. You may not remember Donald Rumsfeld. He was Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, and at some point during the invasion of Iraq, he said something which I thought was quite brilliant and got completely mocked for it in the media. I never understood this. What he said was, there's what we know, in this case about the Iraqi army. There's what we know that we don't know, and there's what we don't know that we don't know. And it's the last that's what can be dangerous. The things that you think that you know, but you actually don't. You don't know the fact that you don't know them. This is what's super dangerous. And the fact that there are things that you don't know would never occur to Elon Musk. It's second nature to Hayek. There's all kinds of things we don't know about issues that are really important to us and that we will never know, and yet we must act anyway. But we must act with the consciousness that we cannot simply command our world, like we cannot command our economy in terms of prices and production and all the other things that communists and doubtless many tech bros dream of in one way or another. So Hayek's knowledge problem and his theory of ignorance properly understood is, I think, a crucial resource to bear in mind in today's world. Another is, and I'm going to use a word that will not make people shriek in fright, but maybe shriek will run away, but it's the philosophical term these days. Hayek is a sufficientarian. He is not an egalitarian. Okay? What's a sufficientarian? Sufficientarians are political philosophers who think that it is very important to make sure that people have a sufficiency. At the very least, that we do not allow large numbers of people to die of starvation in the streets, to die because they have no medical care, to live without housing in the cold, etc., etc., etc. The first sort of example of this in legislation is the English New Poor Law of 1834, which, although its conditions were not exactly great, did make sure that every person in England had a recourse to a government-funded place where they would be fed, not very well, and clothed, not very well, and housed, not very well, but better than what the choice was, which was nothing at all. That was, at the time, considered sufficient. And Hayek says, look, what people are going to consider sufficient is going to vary over time. If you have a wealthier society, naturally the conditions of the Poor Law of 1834 will seem to you completely inadequate. But there's no project here of saying, well, it's, you can't have billionaires, or everybody must have equal incomes or equal wealth. The project here is simply the project, in fact, of liberalism 2.0. Let us fight at least extreme poverty by guaranteeing people some kind of basic social floor. Hayek is a sufficientarian. This extends to health insurance and various other things. What he is not is an egalitarian. What he is not who someone says that we must try to not only create but maintain material equality. Why would that be a bad idea? Because in order to do this, you are going to be compelled to make a whole lot of people afraid, to engage in despotic behaviors, not to mention crash your economy. And it's an important point, I think, for liberals to hold on to both ends of this. The merits of sufficientarianism and the evils of egalitarianism. Why? Because egalitarianism ends up leading to revolution or reaction. A revolution to make that equality take place, with all kinds of catastrophes for the losers, or a reaction against it, which also leads to all kinds of catastrophes for the losers. So these are also points, I think, that we need to retain from Hayek. And certainly not least, Hayek is very strongly anti-nationalist. It's important to remember he's from Vienna, right? What does Vienna mean? Vienna means the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yeah, he's like 20 when it ends, but he's formed in this. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is a multinational state consisting of what is today Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, and parts of Romania. And he thinks, like unfortunately too few other people thought at the time, he thought this was just great. This multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And he thought it was tragic that liberalism had departed from what he saw as its fundamental internationalism. And these are more quotes from Hayek. That 19th century liberalism did not succeed more fully is due largely to its failure, that because of historical accidents, it joined forces with nationalism. Is it too much to hope for a rebirth of real liberalism, true to its ideal of freedom and internationalism? These quotes are taken from an essay he wrote in 1939 called The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. Interstate federalism does not mean the highway system. This is one of the most brilliantly predictive essays ever written. It essentially says, this is what the European Union is going to look like if one ever forms. This is what it's going to be able to do economically. This is what it's going to be constrained from doing economically. It's not 100% accurate, but it's about 80% on target. And for political economic prediction, this is as good as it ever gets. And Hayek's firm rejection of nationalism was something that he maintained throughout his career, and is, I think, a very important thing for liberals to bear in mind in our current atmosphere. Now, what I've been doing for the past 15 minutes or so, as I'm coming to the end of my time here, is demonstrating another aspect of the kind of methodology that I try to employ in the history of political thought. One aspect was treating liberalism as a political tradition as an oyster and not as a tree or as a genealogy. But what I've just been doing now in saying, how we answer the so what question about Hayek, what Hayek can be valuable to us for, is an example of the history of political thought, HPT, for the cognoscenti, as treasure hunting. You can do the history of political thought in two ways. This analogy comes from the British philosopher Derek Parfit. You can do it as an archaeologist. What do archaeologists do when they excavate whatever? They look at the strata, right? They look at, how do things relate to each other horizontally? Where are these objects positioned to one another? Where are these ideas, these thoughts? What's the context? What are the issues? That's the history of political thought as archaeology. But there's another thing you can do with the history of political thought, and that's treasure hunting. You dig down there and you see this really shiny golden object and you take it back up because it's really valuable. In this case, not because you're going to sell it on the underground art market, but because these ideas that we can excavate from Hayek, not just from Hayek, from many other thinkers in the history of political thought. I've devoted much of my career to studying Tocqueville, as Bruce mentioned earlier, and it's in part because there's a whole lot of shiny treasure to be found in Tocqueville. Go home and read more of The Old Regime and the Revolution, as well as Democracy in America. But this is another thing that you can do with the history of political thought. Use it to find treasures which, because they're taken out of context, may need a little adjustment, but which that nevertheless be, I think, of great service to us in facing our fears and our problems, even if they were not precisely Hayek's fears and Hayek's problems in every way. And so I hope this lecture has reminded you that, in fact, Hayek is a treasure.
Hear, hear.
So thank you very much.
We do have time for questions.
So there are two kinds of chapters in this book. In most of the chapters, I talk about a few individual thinkers. But I also thought it was very important to show how liberalism's tires actually hit the road, how liberals actually dealt with particular concrete issues. 7 or 8 of them that I talk about in a couple different chapters. There's only one issue that comes up twice in 2 different chapters, and that's nationalism. It's because the relationship of liberalism and nationalism is very different in the period before 1870 and the period after. Nationalism before 1870 often sees itself precisely in the way you just suggested, as an inclusive force, as among other things pushing liberals to say, well, you don't want to give poor people the vote, but you may be richer than a poor person, you may have more education, but you're not any more German or French or British than that person. You're all members of this nation together. And that our notion of the nation can, in fact, be a notion that is based on its political boundaries and not on ethnic boundaries. So, for example, German nationalists until around 1848, quite a lot of them are anti-Semitic. 1848 happens, German nationalism becomes extremely inclusive. If you look at the debates in the German Convention in 1848, the handful of anti-Semites get voted down. People say, there's nothing wrong with being both a Catholic and a German, as opposed to just a Protestant German. And, it's okay if people even speak other languages at home and they want to have schools that don't teach in German. They can be just as good Germans as long as they, acknowledge they're in a part of a German nation, and after some debate, yeah, all the political debates are going to have to be held in German. But we're really very inclusive and using this concept of the German nation to overcome all kinds of ethnic, religious, linguistic barriers. Turn the page after 1870. Nationalism becomes increasingly exclusive. It's tearing apart the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The German speakers of Austria want to say, we want to either be the dominant nation or maybe we want to go join the Germans. And the Czechs say, we don't want to be part of this multinational empire. We're a nation, national self-determination, one country for Czechs. It's going to have a German minority, that's very unfortunate. But we want one country for Czechs. And again, I use the case of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had been completely read out of German nationalism in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and comes roaring back in the 1870s, saying, instead of saying, okay, yeah, of course these people have a different religion, but they can be just as good Germans as us, no, they can't. They can't be Germans at all, ever, no matter what they do, no matter what they want. Wrong ethnicity, wrong religion, out. So this relationship between inclusion and exclusion and liberalism and nationalism has been historically a very interesting and very complicated one. And I could go on even more length, but I'll stop here. Hope that's something of an answer. Yeah. Okay.
And then we'll,
All right, we'll do this, in fact, French style. Take all the questions at once. Okay, I'll try to hold that one in mind. I think you had a question? Yeah, I thought about putting a section of the book in there on the side I was going to get too off the deep end. Just to answer that very quickly, you look at historians of all different kinds of things. They're all finding breaks. 1870, 1880, 1890. There's clearly something huge happening in Western culture in 96 different domains at that period. Liberalism is just one example of that. And yes, that's an interesting irony, of course, but everything is breaking around then, all kinds of consensuses. Answer the other question quickly about, do I distinguish between the terms liberty and freedom? So one of the things that you will notice about, this is particularly true of America, it's not so true of Europe. In America, it's people on the right who tend to have a preference for liberty, and people on the left who tend to have a preference for freedom. My personal view is that liberty is a rather archaic word, right? It's not a word that we use in ordinary conversation to describe our behaviors, our desires, etc. And I wanted to use the more modern contemporary word freedom. Not to mention, 2 F's is better than 1. Freedom from fear. I guess it would be 3 F's so that I get extra brownie points for alliteration and English language style. And in my case, it was not, I did not intend to make a political choice on the American scale, but I did simply make the more modern word. The Taoist point you raised is a really interesting one, but it'll take me way too long to discuss. So I'm going to leave it aside at least for the moment. And you had 2 questions. I'm only going to answer the last one because that's the theoretically much more interesting one, right? So what do we do about the fears of the illiberal, who are quite rightfully going to be afraid of liberalism? What do we do about the fears of a businessman who is afraid of competition, right? John Stuart Mill talks about this in On Liberty, that you cannot prevent me, let us say, from preaching my atheism because it makes you afraid. And you want to live in a society in which you can bring up your children, in which you never have to worry about them being exposed to an atheist word. Well, yeah, there are some fears that, in fact, we can't avoid inflicting, except at the cost of much greater harm. Now, you can look at this in one of 2 ways. One is which you can say, okay, so now we've got to make a sort of calculus of fear, which fears are higher, which fears are lower. And I'm sure there are analytic philosophers who are just waiting to do that. That doesn't interest me so much. Or we can say, look, there are, in fact, qualitative differences. And I'm going to give you one concrete example and then cut it short. So as you may know, in 1962, there's a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Yoder versus Wisconsin. And it has to do with a family of Amish who do not want to give their kids any kind of education after age 12. Not homeschool them, but this is it for your formal education. And the state of Wisconsin sues and says, no, these kids have to go to school till they're 16. They can be homeschooled, that's fine, but they have to have more education. And the Supreme Court sides with the Amish. Don't have to educate your kids after age 12. That might have been a correct decision in 1962. I think if it was reheard today, that decision from a liberal perspective was wrong. Why? Because people have, as part of their freedom, a right of exit, a right to leave whatever community they were brought up in. If the Amish try to, and I'm not saying they do, obviously they don't, try to tie people up into chairs and say you can't walk out the door, that would obviously be a crime. Well, if you tell people that they're not going to get educated nowadays beyond age 12, they can't walk out the door because they won't be able to get a job. That a minimal education enough to be able to exit is in fact, or ought to be, compulsory from a liberal point of view. To give people, in fact, this right to basic freedom to walk out the door, not be tied up in some sense.